कभी करती हैं मुलाकातें, कभी करती हैं मुलाकातें, कभी यादों में बरसातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें। मन की गहरी झील में कूद जाती हैं कभी, सोच के दरिया के संग संग बहती जाती हैं कभी। चाहे शाम हो या हो रातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें।
Hello and welcome to yet another episode of Kitabnama. We have a rather unusual episode for you in the sense that we have with us not authors as we usually do, but designers. And we're going to be talking about what makes a book cover. What does it mean when we say do not judge or do judge a book by its cover, and how much do we actually judge a book by its cover? I have here with me the very talented Oroon Das, who is he's on his own right now. It would be unfair to slot you, I think, just as a designer. You're also a theatre person and you're also a vocalist. You also sing. But of course, you lead a very talented team of artists and designers. And you've worked on a lot of book covers. We're going to talk about that. I also have with me the equally talented Bena Sareen, who started, she's an MPhil in sociology, switched careers midway, and fortunately for all book lovers became a book designer, was in fact Penguin India's first art director, and I think that's where you and Oroon perhaps worked together. Yes, great. And is now a freelance consultant designer for Aleph, for a relatively new imprint. Let's start by talking about this cliche. Do you judge a book by its cover? Do you, Bena?
I'd be
because
out of
it looks so
business,
yummy.
Namita, if I said I didn't.
Okay.
But I think increasingly a book cover has come to play a much larger role than it did originally, where it was just meant to hold bound pages together and serve as a mere packaging exercise. Given that there's so many books competing in the market today, there are shelves full of hundreds of new titles. So what is it that makes an impulsive buyer pick up a book? I think a cover really comes into play right here.
Oroon, let me ask you, how often have you picked up a book just because you fell in love with its cover?
I think I got introduced to Paulo Coelho entirely on the basis of the covers. I didn't know him at all before that. That was several years ago. I do think, like Bena said, a cover of a book now serves many more purposes than it did perhaps about 30 years ago. And it kind of comes to stand for the signature of the book itself, and therefore it's become more exciting to design book covers now than it might have been.
Given that bookstores are so short on space, what you actually see in a bookshop, in a store, is the spine. You don't even see the cover. So if I was to look at this lovely copy of Amitav Ghosh's Sea of Poppies, it's a beautiful cover. It's a work of art. What I'm seeing in the bookshop is this. So, you know, you put in all this effort, you put in all this labor, you know, and it's down to the spine.
You're absolutely right, Namita. I think the spine is a very critical part of our job here. I mean, and when I do book designs, what you do need is a slightly fat spine to be able to do something.
Yeah.
So for instance, I always try and carry forward an element from the front onto a spine so that it at least stands out from the neighboring spines. I mean, there has to be something that draws you in.
Okay.
But often the space doesn't allow you. I mean, on this there's very little that one could have done.
Absolutely.
So where one can, one tries to make most of every inch of space on the jacket.
And I think clarity and very direct kind of communication is of course topmost on your priority list.
How important is the author's input? And talking about the nuts and bolts of design, who really has primacy? Is it the publisher, is it marketing, or is it the author?
Well, I think the design brief trickles down to you as a designer through a few marketing filters, if you like. You know, the marketing imperatives inform, let's say, even the author's own aesthetic perhaps. sometimes. By the time the brief comes to somebody like me, and some of the briefs have been conveyed to me through Bena herself in the past, I do realize that what is being conveyed to me has those tasks to perform as well. And definitely we go back to the author very many times to seek help on understanding the essence of the book. But a lot of the times I'm quite dependent on the editors. And so I've had editors closely handhold me through arriving at a form that best conveys the book.
And what is the role of the commercial department?
I don't see them as separate segments anymore, actually, Namita. And I think a lot of us who've been designing books for a while, and also most other commercial designers, or I mean, I don't like to use the word commercial, let's say for most designers today, are aware that it's not art for art's sake alone. You do, at the end of the day, you're in business only if your books sell. So I think we already come with that sensibility. It's not as if one or the other department alone can bring that in, or maybe just a sales department will bring that in. Their inputs are valuable, but finally I think it's a combination of briefs from the editor, the designer's own sensibilities, which I think plays the largest role finally, because it's you who are interpreting the various briefs that you've got, and you're the one who's visualizing the words.
Yeah.
I'd like to say that, as what Bena said about that being kind of our job, you know, we are not artists, we are designers. There's an essential difference.
That's not what I'd like to say, put it down as.
Okay, you just
We are
elaborate on
artists
that.
with a commercial sensibility, with an awareness of what works in the market and what doesn't.
Sure, I mean, I
Is
think
how I like to see ourselves.
Okay, fair enough.
I'd just like to sum this up by saying that, like you said, that we need to have a certain awareness of the purpose of what we put out serving. So we know that it's not just something that actually serves our creative impulses, but that it has a job beyond that to do.
Yeah.
Whether it's in the marketplace, whether it is in being able to convey the intention of the author, whether it is to be able to convey, let's say, the target of the marketing planner, you know, that it has a purpose to serve. And it's been quite an education for me personally to be able to marry my own artistic persuasions, if you like, with these purposes that any such exercise must serve. Otherwise, the kind of purpose doesn't, you know, it's defeated.
Let's talk about specifics, Bena. Do you have some of your work that we can look at? Show me something.
Let me just pick on the last thing that Oroon said, that he talked about it being also a marketable idea. I mean, this is something that I wouldn't be able to put on a bookshelf, because you can't read the title from a distance. There is no visual. There's nothing sort of strong and graphic that's sort of inviting you. So this is actually a catalog which I lifted. This was their first catalog, and we designed it and we treated it like a book. But I had the luxury of doing these subtle things like silver on silver embossed, simply because this was being delivered to people's homes. It was being delivered in the hands of the people who we wished would browse through it, and it didn't have to be marketed. It was not for sale. So these are dream projects. But for all the others, you have to do.
Why does this one? Why is this one so dear to you? Because of its subtlety? What is it?
Because here you're able to, I guess, just indulge yourself a bit in what you think is art, whereas the other side of it is you have to be able to put out a name that large, which is, you know, readable across the shelf. You have to be able to put out an element that will compete with 20 other books which are face up, etc., etc.
Understood. This one.
Actually, let me pick up one of Bena's books, which are my favorites. Actually, this one, for instance, I love the way it honors the textural possibilities with paper itself.
Yes.
You know, there isn't any. I mean, if you look at this book, there isn't a visual which has been printed off a photograph or a drawing, but instead it's the cutting of the paper which makes the visual.
Yes.
And these are the sort of things that I think increasingly, because there's such a large number of books and ever more choices in terms of pre-press processes and technology, you can pretty much finish a book cover and send it to press within a couple of hours, pretty much. And you have so much variety to pick from in terms of images and so on and so forth. Something like this really as a designer, and I would say even as a reader, draws my attention immediately, because it has played with the textural quality, the materials at hand, which is printing and paper.
This is an exquisite cover. It's subtle, it's beautiful, it draws on a very rich Indian cultural tradition of paper cutting.
Yes.
That's the point actually I was
Yes.
wanting to make, and that's something that Oroon and I often discuss, that you know, when you're talking about where is an Indian cover design reached today, I'm very happy on a lot of fronts, because as Oroon just pointed out, we have a vast array of materials, technology, online libraries, all of that available to us. But on the other hand, there's that innovation, that originality is somewhere lost, because we are just doing what everybody else does.
That's right. But and I'm guessing that this would be a very expensive book to produce, or am I wrong?
No.
And so then how much does the cost come into play?
No, the cost is absolutely critical, and we work within pretty tight budgets, I have to say. I'm constantly having to plead and request friends and our fellow designers to oblige and do something for me. Our budgets are small. Our budgets are determined purely by the numbers. So if you're printing a 50,000 copy print run, you have the budgets to play around with.
Right.
But if you're doing 2,000 and 3,000, which is often the case, you don't. So one has to innovate within the constraints.
Sure, sure. I want to ask you a question that seems to be a mystery to me, which is that we seem to be living in an era of reprints. And every time there's a reprint, and I have seen this sometimes in bookshops, you'll see the same exact book by the same exact author and two different covers. So what are you trying to do? I mean, is it trying to fool the reader into saying, well, oh, this is a new book, but it's not the new book, it's the same book but a different cover? What's behind that thinking?
Well, a new edition gives you an opportunity to repackage the book with the legacy of what has been gained by readership and by the material coming into the public domain and staying there for a period of time. And I think many designers have used that to their advantage.
Sure. Is there a reprint that stands out for you?
Oh, well, actually, the book that I started doing this with was Vikram Seth's 4 of his books. At the time that Equal Music was coming out, Penguin was repackaging all the prior editions, and just by a fluke of chance, I happened to be there and got assigned the task. And I just did watercolors for all the 4. So there was a collection of poems, and there was Suitable Boy, and there was Heaven's Lake, and Golden Gate.
Of course.
And I could afford to do these abstract watercolors because Vikram Seth is a known brand, and those books had made a substantial presence in public memory.
Right.
And therefore, at this moment of bringing out the subsequent edition of the book, which has been seen and read before, one could afford to go more arty, if you like. And as it happened, I was lucky with these books, and it got me a fair amount of attention.
Both of you as designers, just judging you by your covers, seem to be very understated. And you're not like this loud, exuberant, and a lot of Indian design is actually loud, exuberant, and all about color. So how does this come about? I mean, I'm looking at Omer Ahmed's book, Journeys into Bhutan. I mean, what a beautiful cover this is. Really, it's subtle. You talked about watercolors, and that's what triggered this off. It's almost like a, like a Japanese Zen kind of. It's, Would you like to talk about this?
I think when I got into book publishing, I just brought in so much color that I had to finally become conscious and restrain myself. So it's a very personal thing, and it's a very bizarre story, but I find that a lot of my phases, whether it's in book design or the kind of wardrobe that I'm into or whatever else that I do, they all sort of seamlessly merge into one another. So yes, this is the season of pale colors, and it started with this, it moved on to this, and there are a host of other books, until I become so acutely conscious that I'm doing the same thing that I have to move away. But there is no conscious decision to do color or not do color, and I think it's just I really think it's a lot to do with the kind of personal space you're in at that moment, which influences the genre of books that you're dealing with. I mean, that is the first thing that you're addressing.
Okay, Oroon, you?
Well, I think in terms of a palette, you have several more now, almost with every passing year, not just color, but in the different ways you can treat an image, in the different ways you can produce and reproduce an image. The palette just keeps expanding exponentially. I think part of our work, our job, is also to know how less and how little to do, what not to do. In fact, particularly in Bena's work, what I like most is that there is no hurry to impress the reader or the person who's looking at the visual with how clever the creation has been. And hence you're able to, you're confronted with a quietude, with the precision of what is being said. So, for instance, even this one is one of my favorite ones.
That's one of my favorites too, I have to say.
Hers. This is Jerry Pinto's not very new book, his second last. It's absolutely beautiful, and also this brings into perhaps our discussion the idea of craft in making the visual, or making the craftsmanship of actually making a book cover. You know, there was a time when the first thought that would come to your mind when asked to make the book for an author, very often your friends would actually come up to you and say, "Acha, hamara book cover bana do." The first thing that would come to your mind ki, what drawing am I going to make, or what painting am I going to make, or which photographer friend am I going to ask to lend me a photograph?
Right.
Whereas now you can actually create an image on the computer. There's a different way in which images can be generated, and I'm not necessarily taking a value position on these varying positions, but it's interesting that the richness that comes from each of these sources can be compromised one in favor of the other. And I like Bena's covers because for this reason that very often illustration is given a primary position.
Sure. I want to ask you another question, which is, I belong to a generation of readers who grew up reading books, you know, that was like a formulaic cover. You know, you had the stripes and they were all color coded, orange for fiction, blue and so on. So the two broad stripes, the white one in the middle. And in a very ironic way, you were almost denying the book its individual identity.
Right.
But you were saying that when you buy this orange stripy band book, this is an assurance of quality. You're going to spend your 40 rupees or 30 rupees. This is going to be a great investment. Today, we've come to an age where you have very idiosyncratic covers, very individualized, very personalized, but also very cliched. You know, when I go to the bookstore and I look at chiclet, okay, for instance, they will all be purple or pink, they will be glittery, they will have a high heel or a cleavage, they will have a lipstick or a mobile phone. When I look at a crime novel, there will always be this shadowy dude, you know, this mystery guy in the background. He's either wearing a hood or he's just this, you know, kind of faceless silhouette. When it's a period book, you have layers of fog, you know, which sort of seem to add to that. And I cannot even begin to count the number of books of women in long white dresses. Oh my God, I think that would take up a bookshelf or many bookshelves. So what have we actually achieved? You know, you've sort of individualized books, but we're stuck in a cliche. So have we really progressed, or is this a regression?
I think it's certain genres which do this. And it is the books that sell more, it is the books that bring in more money. That is because it is targeting a larger audience. And I'm not passing a value judgment on the readership here, because they're the ones who bring in our bread and butter. But chicklet, crime, and lately mythology, they all imitate one another. The other impulse for a publishing house is that, you know, sometimes you get a brief that annoys every designer when you're told to make your cover look like another cover. And that's something that we're constantly trying to stay away from. But I can understand that when that comes from a marketing perspective, because that's the best pitch they've got, that so and so is like Khalid Hosseini is the kite runner.
Right.
So you try and piggyback, you sort of piggyback on that.
There is a sense of trying to lead by...
But it's not there in other genres, and I'm very relieved that it hasn't sort of crossed all the other genres. Not poetry, not literary fiction, not the usual non-fiction.
Right, right. I know we're running out of time, so I don't mean to rush you, but I'm going to ask you that we live in an age of self-publishing where you have the templates of design available to any would-be writer. What do you see as the future? What are the future trends in design, Oroon?
Well, I think the future is very open, which means that while the bigger brands which are conscious of the bigger pools of marketability, individuals are not bound by those constraints. And therefore you have, for example, this is a good example of an illustration made on the computer based on an Art Nouveau style. by Smriti Gargi Ishwar and employed on the catalogue of Indian literature abroad, and conveys very aptly. It's a woman's image derived from a Raja Ravi Verma painting, and then there are other elements added to the image, and people I find are invested, authors are invested in creating the image which actually conveys, because the image itself, what you were talking about a moment ago, about the brands having resolved their identity to a point where the brand will speak for itself. Similarly, I think some people are invested in the idea of making the image which can speak for itself, and that in itself I think is a worthwhile trip to be on.
Yeah, well, I find it very interesting that both of you have picked up catalogues as kind of your favorite design, and you know, I want to thank you both for being here. I'm really sorry we're well out of time, but you've given us a lot of food for thought. I'm certainly going to be thinking, and the next time I pass a bookshop and I look at a book and I look at a book cover, I know the effort that went into it, and all the more respect to you for the work you do. Thank you
so much.
Thank you.
We have Anand with us, who's an eminent Malayalam writer, and he's going to talk a little bit about the Book of Destruction, or Samharathinte Pustakam, before we both do the reading of an excerpt from the book.
The subject of violence had always been of great interest to me throughout my writings. And while pursuing the subject, I came across the phenomenon of sacrifice, which I thought would be able to explain the whole problem in a concise manner. So the sacrifice is common to all religions, right from Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and of course Hinduism. And sacrifice, I found that there are three phases of it. One is sacrificing another being before the Godhead, and the second thing is sacrificing the victim as well as the sacrificer. The sacrificer often sacrifices himself. That is Fidai type of. The third is sacrificing the Godhead itself, as in Chinnamasta Kali or the say Eucharist in Christianity. So in this process I selected three type of episodes and started writing it.
What is the excerpt that we are going to read today?
This is a portion from the second chapter of it, where a highly bewildering incident is narrated, which is followed with a lot of intriguing episodes later on. So I will just read a few lines and then you can read it in the English. ഇങ്ങനെയാണ് സംഭവം തുടങ്ങുന്നത്. ഒരാൾ നഗരത്തിൽ വന്നതിന് ശേഷം ഒരു ഹോട്ടലിൽ ചെക്ക് ഇൻ ചെയ്യുന്നു. സാധനങ്ങൾ മുറിയിൽ വെച്ച് കുളിച്ച് നഗരത്തിൻ്റെ വൈകുന്നേരത്തിൻ്റെ വെളിച്ചവും വായുവും ആസ്വദിക്കാമെന്ന് കരുതി മുറി അടച്ച് വെളിയിലേക്ക് ഇറങ്ങുന്നു.
Now I will read the same excerpt in English a little bit. A traveler comes to a city and checks into a hotel. He unpacks, has a bath, and heads out for some fresh air with the intention of exploring the city. Evening sets in, street lamps turn on one by one, and the lights begin to appear in the windows. Suddenly he realizes that he has forgotten to take the card of the hotel with him and cannot now remember its name. He has already walked quite a bit and appears to have lost his way. After several failed attempts to locate his hotel, he goes into a nearby hotel and approaches the receptionist at the front desk. He tells her his story and gives her, to the best of his abilities, a description of the hotel he has checked into. The girl gives him a wide grin and informs him this is his hotel. Does he not remember? He is positive it is not. It was not such a tall building and it had no garden in front of it as this one has. Moreover, contrary to the girl's claim, he was confident that it was not she who had checked him in. The person who had checked him in was a morose young man wearing a white shirt, a tie, and this girl was nowhere in sight then. When he continues to protest, her smile fades, she hands him the key to his room and with her pen points him in the direction of the lift with an imperiousness that makes him uneasy. He submits, takes the key, summons the lift and goes to room number 412 as indicated on the key. To his surprise, he finds all his belongings inside, innocently arranged, just as if he might have left them there. The clothes he had changed out of were in the wardrobe, the book he was reading at the bedside table. But he is still certain this was not the room he had checked into. The bed and the sheets were different. There had been only one window. This one has 2 windows. And he couldn't argue with the fact that all his belongings were there though. This is not a story I have constructed for entertaining you. It was an experience of a friend of mine. Well, can't really call him a friend, not even a proper acquaintance. I have had occasion to meet him maybe 4 times in a period of few years in various railway coaches in the berth opposite mine. Speak of coincidences. Hassan ibn al-Sabah was his name. Not a very common name in our country, and if it weren't strange enough, this man bearing an unusual name whom I had met before in bizarre circumstances calls me in the dead of the night and describes to me an experience straight out of fiction.